woman is spinning yarn. She sits and she spins and she hums. She hums a lullaby. It's a lullaby that she used to sing to her daughter when her daughter was small. And when I say she spins, it's not a spinning wheel. This is from the days before spinning wheels. She's using a spindle. If you've never seen a spindle to spin, imagine, if you will, a wooden stick or rod and a circular wooden base. A weight holds it down, and the wool, or in this case, the flax, to make linen, very much like wool, but made of plant material like cotton, starts off in a fluffy ball in one hand and then is twisted into a line and tied onto the spindle. And as the spindle is twisted, the weight spins and pulls it down. So the yarn and the fibers are twisted and spun and begin to draw downwards and begin to pull together a slim, perfectly shaped yarn, a beautiful thread of linen. The woman who sits and spins and hums a lullaby to her baby daughter watches as she spins her spindle and expertly judges how much flax to tease out, how much to let twist and bind, how much to keep in her hands, and slowly an ever-growing spool of yarn builds on that spindle. She sits and sings and spins. She's sitting by a fire, a warm fire that crackles and glows, and the yellowish flames lick like tongues. But she is dirty. She's smudged with mud or earth. And her clothes are torn, not patched, torn, ragged, and again covered in earth. She sits on a stool, sitting and spinning and humming by the fire. But she is also surrounded by men. A semicircle of men. Some of them have weapons, axes or swords. Some of them just agricultural tools that could be used as weapons. Some, the occasional one, has armor. And the one who steps forward and speaks her name, Ulfhildr. He has a big shield with a big iron boss in the center. At the sound of her name, she looks up at him and stops spinning for a moment, but then returns to her spinning. And the man with the shield shrugs, hefts his shield on his arm and looks at the other men. They don't know what to do. And then women enter and they move between the men, between the semicircle of men, pushing them out of the way, and they come and sit down and kneel down next to Ulfhildr. Some sob, some hold her, and some stroke her hair and just watch. If we move our vision outwards, we can see that this is less the scene of a drudge sitting next to her cottage fire and spinning in the filth. In fact, the fire that she's sitting next to is not the fire of her hearth or her cooking fire. The fire is what is left of her home, burning. Timbers and logs have tumbled around her and lie on the floor, lying on top of one another, smouldering, smoking, cracking in the heat. The men that stand around her are not the first men to be here today at her home. But these men who are here now, they are friends, they are neighbors, but not like the other men who were here earlier. Not like them at all. Earlier in the day, Ulfhildr was out gathering mushrooms on the hillside. She'd left the farmstead that she owned with her husband and their little daughter Thjalfa, still a child at 9 years old. Ulfhildr had gone up to the slope, the wooded slope that leant over the farmhouse and had a good view of the fjord that came and met the edge of the farmland, its deep, cold water butting up hard against the sudden drop-off of the land. She moved through the late spring, warm afternoon, the winds bringing the smell of sap of the pine trees to her nose. And with a basket in one hand, she bent down and plucked another yellow, sulphur-coloured, trumpeted chanterelle and put it in the basket with the rest of the mushrooms. She moved from tree to tree and picked and cut the mushrooms and gathered them. But then she noticed the smoke. Smoke from her home. And it wasn't the smoke from the hearth fire. There was too much smoke for that. And maybe her husband was burning something back on the farmstead, but it was the smoke she could see, and also that and the strange sail she could see on the ship that was moored up at the jetty where her land met the fjord's water. That is what worried her. She rushed down the hill, moving from tree to tree, from trunk to trunk, to see what was going on. Surely everything was all right, but why the smoke? And then she reached a point where she could see between the trees, and she could see that the smoke was coming from her home. Her home was burning. And from that ship with the strange sail she didn't recognize, there were armoured men moving backwards and forwards from the ship and to her home and back. And they were leading sheep and goats and carrying cheeses and casks and barrels and bolts of cloth. Her animals, her food, her possessions. And then she saw her husband, stood near the bottom of the jetty, slumped and suspended between two of the armoured men. His face bloodied and blackened, his bones broken beneath the skin, and his head lolling on his chest. But where was little Thjalfa? Where was she? The little 9-year-old girl, there she was. Still definitely very much a child, but brave as her parents, as brave as her father, and as brave as her mother. There she was, hiding behind the water butt with a little hatchet in her hand, a hatchet used for cutting wood, but an axe nonetheless. And she was watching, looking at her father, being held by the two soldiers. And as Ulfhildr watched, there was a shout from one of the men on the ship, perhaps their leader. He said something about no space for deadweight, no space for slaves. And at that, one of the men who was holding her husband nodded, drew his sword, and ran it through her husband. Ulfhildr had to put her hands across her mouth to stop herself from crying out, the basket of mushrooms tumbling from her hands and bouncing on the ground. She hurried down, further down the hill, ducking between the trees as she went. Her husband simply grunted with pain and sank to his knees. But then with a glorious roar of rage, he stood up again, stood up to his full height, drew the sword from the belt of the other man next to him, and in one swift movement dispatched him. But in doing so, made himself vulnerable to the original man who had stabbed him, who then sliced his blade across the back of her husband's neck, and he fell down dead. Little Thjalfa, hiding behind the water butt, now with rage in her voice, such a small thing, such a delicate little thing, but holding the hatchet over her head, ran screaming out, having seen her father killed in front of her eyes, and ran screaming towards the one man who still stood on the jetty. He and the others in the boat all laughed at the little thing that was running towards him, running with the axe high in her hand. They laughed to see such a funny sight. Oh, but the man on the jetty stopped laughing as that hatchet was bang, hammered and sliced into the top of his thigh. With the back of his fist, he cuffed her and the axe spinning from her fingers, little Thialfa span in the air and ended up face down on the jetty. The man turned round and looked at the men in the boat and shrugged. And the man in the boat, probably their leader, again said, "No space for deadweight, no space for slaves." And as Ulfhildr watched, the remaining man on the jetty put his foot on the girl's back and pushed his sword through the little body, pulling it back out, wiping it on her dress before sheathing it. And even from the distance she was from her little girl, she could hear her blood tinkling as it fell into the unforgiving water below. But this time the man on the jetty had a very different opponent to face. This time he faced a woman, a mother enraged, her knife held over her head, screaming down at him like a Valkyrie. But her rage had unbalanced her. And as she brought down the knife to slash at his face, he simply brought up his arm and blocked it and knocked her on the side of the head with the pommel of his sword, and she fell flat on her back on the jetty, stars popping in front of her vision. In the distance somewhere, in a watery hearing, she could hear a man's words again saying, "No space for dead weight, no space for slaves." The man who was still stood on the jetty looked around and said something or shouted something back, and the men on the boat told him to hurry up and get it over and done with. They had to go. And as her vision cleared and her mind began to settle and she began to orient herself, Ulfhildr became aware that while she was lying on her back on the jetty, that a man was climbing on top of her, climbing over her, and she could feel his weight on her body. Quite quickly, she gave up pummeling his tough, armored skin and reached around herself, trying to find something to defend herself with as he crept on top of her, and she felt him crushing her under his weight. But then his eyes opened wide and his mouth opened and gasped as she had found the sword that had slain her husband and thrust it through his side, and then she levered him off her, pulling it out of his ribs, standing, stalking down the jetty towards the boat full of all the other men and their leader. But they were ready to go, and they simply pushed their oars against the jetty and pushed off, pushing their longboat into the center of the fjord, there where the men fitted the rows to their locks and bent to the task and began to row. As the ship began to pull away from Ulfhildr's burning house and the place where her husband and her daughter had died, she watched that boat and the men in it, especially the man who turned around and shrugged his shoulders. What was he to do? No space for deadweight, no space for slaves. But she watched that ship disappear all the way up the fjord until eventually it turned a corner and was gone. And then, and only then, did the sword clatter from her hand, and did Ulfhildr sink to her knees and sob. Her neighbours, her friends, had seen the strange sail, had seen the smoke from the farmstead, and had rushed to help, but too late. Too late. And it was that then, as they found her, sitting by the burning ruins of her house, spinning flax into linen. Time is a great healer, but grief leaves scars. And whilst Ulfhildr's house, with the help of her friends and her neighbours, was rebuilt, even the local nobleman, the local jarl, Erik Steinsson, he sent some money and a couple of hefty blokes to help rebuild, and a couple of sheep and goats to help her get started again. And yes, her home was rebuilt and she lived through the summer and survived the winter. But it really was just surviving. And sitting down at the end of the seasons as the first snows began to fall, as she sat and carded the wool and began to spin that into yarn, she came to a decision. She would become a Shieldmaiden, and she would go and she would seek glorious death in battle. Her husband had died with a sword in his hand, died fighting. Even her little daughter had died with an axe in her hand, died fighting. If they had died fighting and with weapons in their hands, surely then Odin would have taken them to Valhalla. And if not Odin, then maybe Freya, the goddess of beauty, of war, of magic, and of so many other things. Maybe she would take them to Folkvang, her hall. Everybody knows about Valhalla, and everybody knows that Odin can take the souls of the glorious dead, and they will sit in Valhalla and drink and wrestle and fight and die and be born again in the morning until the end of all things, until Ragnarok, when they will rise and fight on the side of the gods. But many people don't know that Freya also has her hall, and she may select half of those glorious dead to go to her hall, where they may sit and drink and wrestle and fight and enjoy their afterlife until Ragnarok, until the end of all things, when they will rise once more and don their battle gear and go and do battle for the gods themselves. She would become a Shieldmaiden. She would die gloriously in battle, and she would be reunited with her husband and with her daughter, little Thjalfa. As the snows began to settle around her, she began to prepare for a journey, prepare for a new life. She would go and see the Jarl, Erik Steinsson. He'd been very generous. He sent money and men and animals. Surely he would let her go and maybe even give her some equipment or lend her some equipment so she could become a Shieldmaiden. She spun her wool. And as she spun it, and as she wove it, she sang the magical songs, the Seder songs, the songs of the Norns, the songs of Freya. Now, whilst everyone thinks of Vikings, they think of big, hairy blokes with massive beards and possibly with horned helmets. And we all know that's not allowed here, everyone. But you forget about the women. Some were Shieldmaidens. There were female Viking warriors raiding here in Britain, raiding across Europe, possibly even across the world, even to the Americas. But also the women who stayed at home. They weren't just running the hoover around the house. Yes, they had to look after the house and the children and the animals and everything that was there, but they had responsibility, they had power, they had the hearth magic. They were the ones who could weave the magic into the food and drink, the very house and the very clothing that people wore. And that's what she did now. Ulfhildr wove the magic into the yarn that she was spinning and into the cloth that she was weaving. And as she did it, she added little hairs. Before they had had their funerals, she took a lock of hair from little Thjalfa and a lock of hair from her husband. And every so often she would choose one of these hairs and it would go into the thread, into the wool and be woven into the woolen fabric. And she would sing the Seder songs for protection for her, to ask Odin for his slyness and protection and strength in battle, for Heimdall, the watchman, to watch over her and to watch over her husband and to watch over her daughter, wherever they be in Asgard now. As the first springs came, as flowers began to burst up through the ground and snows began to melt and ice began to trickle and drip from icicles, she made the journey to the Jarl's house, the Jarl's hall, the nobleman's hall. She took down from the mantelpiece her husband's sword, a sword that he hadn't had time to reach. but she now buckled it on and felt comfort in its wide leather-girdled belt and the weight of it sitting against her left thigh. When she got to the Jarl's hall, she had to surrender the sword to the guards, of course. But she was just a woman in just a woolen tunic. She'd given up her sword, but when she asked to speak to the Jarl, and they said, "Business is over for tonight. Come back tomorrow." "Come back tomorrow," said the two guards blocking her way. She could see through them into his hall. She could see the Jarl up at the high table, enjoying his supper, desperately trying to ignore all the noblemen and the visiting merchants and the dignitaries and his warriors and his huscarls, his guard, who were all there. He was just sitting there trying to have a quiet drink and food while everyone tried to, hey, all right, try to ingratiate themselves with him. Don't mind if I do. "Come back tomorrow," said the guards. "Thank you," she said, and smiled sweetly at both of them, and then pushed through and marched forward, straight up between the lines of tables, straight up towards the high table at the back. The two guards running along next to her with their shields and their spears, but what would they do? They couldn't just beat her to the ground. That felt wrong. So when she arrived at the high table, they just stood to attention near her, menacingly. She knew that Jarl Erik Steinsson knew that she was there. And she knew he knew she was there. And she knew he knew she knew he was, all that. But clearly he was ignoring her. He sat and he ate. He picked at his dish. He picked at the meat on his bowl, and he didn't look up. She waited politely. And then eventually she cleared her throat. But still nothing. He continued to pick at his food, continued to drink. "Jarl Erik Steinsson, I'm busy," he said. "You are eating," Ulfhilda replied. "I'm busy eating," said the Jarl without looking up, and then turned to his advisor over his shoulder. "Who the fuck is this?" The advisor leant over and whispered in his, the widow. Oh, yes, he remembered something about it. Some raiders, a widow, he'd helped her. Yes, he'd helped this kind old lady. What was it that she wanted? And he looked up. But it wasn't the kind old lady he was expecting. Here was Ulfhilda. She was tall. She had hair like winter fire, skin as white as milk, and eyes like chips of blue granite, and she was beautiful. Now that got his attention. "So, widow, how can your Jarl help you?" "Just two things," she said. "I have requests to make. Two things from my Jarl." Because there's always two things, by the way. There's always two things. "Firstly, I wish to ask permission that I may leave your lands and journey beyond, and I may do this freely." "Of course," said the Jarl. "You have my permission. Journey onwards. What else can your Jarl do for you?" "Secondly, I wish you to lend me a shield and armor so that I may go forth and die gloriously in battle." Hang on, whoa, what? Wait, no, what? You want me to lend you a shield and armor? "Yes," she said. "And you're going to bring it back?" "Yes," she said. "But you're going to go and die gloriously in battle?" Oh, yes, she hadn't quite thought that through. It sounded better in her head. "Well, I will go and I will repay you for the loan of the battle gear that you give me. But how many battles have you actually fought in?" asked the Jarl. "Well, none yet." "Okay, and who have you trained under?" "I haven't really trained at all." "Right, so you want me to lend you a shield and a suit of armor so you can go and die gloriously in battle, but you'll repay me even though you have no training and no experience and your aim is to die?" "Well, but I wish to go and die gloriously in battle so that I may be reunited with my husband and my daughter in Valhalla or in Freya's Folkgang. I've got a better idea. said the Jarl. One day you'll be reunited with them. But until then, why don't you just... why don't you put aside your thoughts of death and battle and why don't you stay here and keep me warm tonight instead? The other warriors and merchants and dignitaries and general drunken fools with enormous beards in the room all went, "Aye!" at the idea. But Ulfhildr wasn't impressed. No, she said, no. Please lend me the equipment and I promise that I will repay you for the loan of it or for its replacement. No. I tell you what, you stay here. Keep me warm tonight. "Hey!" shouted the crowd. And I will lend you the stuff, all right? I will lend it to you. We'll do that. Lend it to you free of charge. No, she said. You lend it to me. I will repay you, but I will not keep you warm tonight. Ooh, went the crowd. And he went backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards until eventually Ulfhildr said, fine. You lend me a suit of armor that fits me and a shield that will suit me. I will repay you if you can beat me in a fight to wrestle me here tonight. You lend me that and I will repay you. And if I lose, I'll stay here and keep you warm tonight. But if I win, as well as the armor and the shield, you'll keep me warm tonight, but at the foot of your bed, like the dog that you are. And the whole hall exploded into a roar. Beards everywhere. All right, said the Jarl. All right, okay, all right. He couldn't refuse this. Very well. I mean, she had no experience. She had no training. He was going to beat, of course he was going to beat her. He was going to end up with a good deal tonight. Very well then, clear a space, he said, and he stood up and shrugged off his cloak, took off his sword belt and handed it to someone important. Now, when he stood up, Ulfhildr realized that he was quite a big lad, and he'd clearly done this quite a few times. This was not his first rodeo. He stepped down, and he placed his hand on her waist and his hand on her shoulder, and she put her hand on his waist and her hand on his shoulder, and the two of them got ready, and when someone told them to, the fight began. And she pushed, she pushed, she heaved, he didn't move. She couldn't move him, and he just grinned and smiled, and all the people, all the beards around the outside were cheering away. And then when he was ready, when he felt her a little off guard, he just leant forward and put her on her backside. Down in the dust she fell. Hooray! Went all the beards in the room. Such cheers. And he stood there quietening everyone. It was, after all, just an inexperienced little woman, just a poor widow, after all. Blah, 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 blah. As the warriors were dipping down and hoiking her up to her feet, a young woman appeared through the legs and through the press of bodies, pushing them out of the way. A young woman, beautiful, so beautiful, it was almost hard to look at her. She had beautiful blonde hair. Her face was exquisite, and round her neck she had, hanging almost as a pendant, a single falcon's feather. And she put her hand onto Ulfhildr's shoulder and said, "He's too experienced. He's too heavy and he's too strong. Don't try and fight the way he fights. Use what you know. Fight smart," she said, and ducked back, and the press of warriors closed around. Boom! She was hoiked up to her feet. "Have you had enough?" he said. "Are you ready? Have you finished?" Ulfhildr put up her hands and said, "Okay, that was very good. That was very good. So I guess you're interested in these?" And the Jarl said, "Yep." And she said, "You're interested in all this?" And he said, "Yep." And she said, "And you're interested in this?" And he said, "Yep." And while he was peering down, One big bunched fist, as fast and hard as she could, a proper haymaker, lifted up, connected under his chin, and lifted him up but off the ground and put him on his backside on the floor. Quick as a flash, she was there between his legs, kneeling, just with one knee, kneeling. Far too light to hold him down, far too weak to restrain him. She just knelt and put one knee between his legs. And as she sat up, she leant forward. Oh, do you give in? No, yes, all right, I submit. And he tapped out. She stood up, reached out her hand, helped the Jarl to his feet, and the room exploded with cheers. She had won. The Jarl, straightening his trousers, the Viking equivalent, stood there and said, very well, you have won. Armourer, get her some armour tomorrow that fits her, get her a shield that fits her. For tonight, ale and mead, bring it. And much mead and much ale was drunk that night. And true to his word, after much mead and much ale was drunk, the two of them went to bed in the Jarl's bed, and she tucked herself up in his nice furs and blankets, and he lay down at her feet like the dog that he was. But it gets cold up north. And it was less than an hour into the night when Ulfhildra flipped back a sheet and invited the Jarl back into his own bed, and they both kept each other warm, sometimes taking turns. In the morning, she was fitted with a suit of armour that fitted her perfectly, boiled leather connected with chain mail, and a shield, big enough to fit her, but small enough to be light enough for her to use and wield. With that, and a new spear and her husband's sword at her hip, she went out, vowing that she would be back and that she would repay the Earl his money, and she thanked him for the loan of his arms and armour, and he thanked her as well, but that is for other reasons.